On the morning of June 19, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Robert H. Isley sat in the cockpit of his Hellcat fighter aboard USS Lexington, watching his radar scope with mounting disbelief. 100 miles away, beyond the horizon, beyond what any human eye could see, a massive formation of Japanese aircraft was approaching. He could see every single one of them as glowing blips on his screen. The Japanese pilots, meanwhile, flew in perfect formation, confident in their surprise attack, completely unaware they'd been spotted before. They even crossed the first 50 miles of ocean. What happened next would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and it would shatter Japan's naval aviation forever. But here's what the Japanese pilots didn't know. American ships could see them coming from over 100 miles away. American fighters were vectored directly to their position by invisible radio waves, and even when Japanese planes slipped through the fighter screen, American anti-aircraft shells would detonate automatically when they came within killing range. No direct hit required. The Japanese were fighting blind against an enemy that could see everything. This is the story of how American radar technology created what Japanese pilots described as fighting against ghosts, an invisible electronic barrier that turned the vast Pacific Ocean into a killing field where stealth, courage, and surprise meant nothing. By 1944, captured Japanese officers examining American radar equipment would make a chilling admission. We realized we had been fighting the war with our eyes closed. But the story doesn't begin in 1944. It begins 3 years earlier, on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, when 2 young soldiers spotted something impossible on a brand new radar screen, and nobody believed them. December 7, 1941, 7:02 a.m. Opana Point, Oahu. Private Joseph Lockard and Private George Elliott were supposed to shut down their SCR-270 radar set at 7 a.m. They'd been manning the mobile radar station since 4 a.m. as part of a training exercise, and their shift was over. But Lockard wanted extra practice reading the oscilloscope, so they kept the system running. At 7:02, a massive blip appeared on the screen. The signal was so large it overwhelmed the display. Lockard checked the equipment. Nothing was malfunctioning. He calculated the distance, 136 miles north, closing fast. This wasn't a single plane. This was a formation so large the radar could barely process it. They called the information center at Fort Shafter. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, the only officer on duty that Sunday morning, took the call. He listened to Lockard's report of a massive formation approaching from the north and said 5 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Don't worry about it. Tyler assumed they were detecting a flight of American B-17 bombers expected from California that morning. The radar operators had no way to identify what they were detecting, only that something very large was approaching very fast. 55 minutes later, 183 Japanese aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes launched from 6 aircraft carriers struck Pearl Harbor. The radar had detected them perfectly. The technology had worked exactly as designed. But the system, the integration of technology with command decisions and rapid response, had failed catastrophically. But here's the critical thing most people miss. While Pearl Harbor exposed America's failure to properly use radar, it also revealed something terrifying to Japan. The Americans had radar. They'd detected the attack force 136 miles out, almost an hour before the bombs fell. And that radar wasn't cutting-edge military equipment. It was a training unit operated by 2 soldiers who weren't even supposed to be on duty. The Japanese Navy had nothing comparable. Japan entered World War II as the world's most experienced carrier aviation force. Their pilots had honed their skills over China for years. They specialized in dawn attacks, nighttime approaches, and using weather to mask their movements. Their entire tactical doctrine was built around achieving surprise, catching the enemy unprepared, striking before defenses could respond, and disappearing before counterattacks could be organized. But surprise requires one critical element. The enemy can't see you coming, and radar changed everything. The United States Navy had begun developing shipboard radar in the late 1930s. The CXM radar system, installed on American carriers and battleships starting in 1940, could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 70 miles and surface ships beyond 20 miles. By contrast, visual detection maxed out around 20 miles on a clear day. and often far less in the clouds, haze, or poor visibility that characterized much of the Pacific. Consider what this meant. A Japanese strike force could launch aircraft 200 miles from an American carrier, time their approach for dawn, use cloud cover to mask their final run, and expect to achieve complete surprise. Exactly the tactics that had devastated the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. But with radar, American carriers spotted those strike packages while they were still 70 to 100 miles away. That gave fighter directors 20 to 30 minutes to launch interceptors, vector them toward the threat using radio guidance, and position defensive fighters between the attackers and the fleet. The Japanese thought they were masters of stealth, but they were about to discover. They'd brought binoculars to a contest against X-ray vision. You know that at the Battle of Coral Sea in May, WWII, the first carrier battle in history, where the opposing fleets never saw each other, USS Lexington's CXM-1 radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 68 miles. For the Japanese pilots, it was incomprehensible. They'd launched from their carriers, flown low to avoid detection, and approached through cloud cover. They should have achieved total surprise. Instead, American fighters were already airborne and waiting for them. After Coral Sea, the whispers began in Japanese ready rooms. Somehow, the Americans always knew they were coming. By mid-1942, American radar technology wasn't just detecting aircraft. It was fundamentally rewriting the rules of naval warfare. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 proved it decisively. At 5:53 a.m. on June 4th, the radar station on Midway Island detected the incoming Japanese airstrike at 93 miles. The operators could see the formation size, the approach direction, and could track it continuously. Midway's fighters launched immediately. By the time the Japanese planes arrived, the island's defenders were ready, and the crucial element of surprise was gone. Meanwhile, aboard the American carriers, the CXM radar sets were providing something the Japanese fleet lacked entirely: situational awareness. American fighter directors could see approaching threats, track friendly aircraft, and coordinate defensive fighters in real time. The Japanese had to rely on lookouts with binoculars and incredible luck. After Midway, captured Japanese documents revealed something stunning. Japanese analysts identified their lack of radar as one of the critical factors in their defeat. But the Americans weren't standing still. By 1943, radar technology was advancing at an extraordinary pace. New models appeared every few months, each one more capable than the last. The SK and SK-2 air search radars could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The SG surface search radar could spot ships and submarines at 15 to 20 miles, even small patrol craft that would be invisible to human eyes. Most devastating of all, the Americans were installing these systems on every major combat ship. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, even submarines were getting radar. The entire U.S. fleet was becoming electronically aware. The implications were staggering. Japanese tactics that had worked for decades became obsolete overnight. Night attacks? The Americans could see them coming in total darkness. Surface search radars detected approaching ships, and fighter directors could vector night fighters equipped with their own airborne radar to intercept bombers. The Japanese Navy's legendary prowess in night combat, perfected since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, evaporated when American ships could see in the dark. Low-altitude approaches didn't matter. Radar detected aircraft regardless of altitude. Japanese pilots who skimmed the wave tops to avoid detection found American fighters diving on them from above, vectored perfectly to the intercept point by ships they'd never seen. Bad weather attacks? Useless. Radar worked perfectly through clouds, rain, and fog. Japanese pilots who used weather fronts as cover discovered that American defenses were just as effective in zero visibility as in clear skies. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Sadamu, a Japanese dive bomber pilot who survived the war, later wrote in his memoirs, "By late 1943, we stopped believing we could achieve surprise against American task forces. We assumed they always knew we were coming. We didn't understand how. Many of us thought they had spies on our carriers or that they'd broken all our codes. The idea that they could see us with radio waves seemed like science fiction. But what Japanese pilots didn't fully grasp was that radar wasn't just detecting them. It was enabling an entire system of layered defenses that made attacking American fleets nearly suicidal. Here's how it worked. American carrier task forces established combat information centers, specialized rooms packed with radar displays, radio equipment, and plotting tables. Trained operators watched multiple radar screens simultaneously, tracking every aircraft within 100 miles. When a bogey appeared, an unidentified aircraft formation, the process began immediately. Fighter directors would identify the threat's bearing, distance, altitude, and heading. They'd calculate intercept courses and vector combat air patrol fighters toward the threat using radio commands. Vector 270, Angels 15, bogeys at 50 miles, turn to heading 270 degrees, climb to 15,000 feet. Enemy aircraft 50 miles ahead. The Japanese pilots never knew what hit them. They'd be flying in formation, completely unaware they'd been detected. When American Hellcats would suddenly appear from advantageous positions, diving from above, attacking with the sun behind them, perfectly positioned for the kill. Did you know that by 1944, American fighter direction had become so precise that pilots regularly intercepted specific bogeys they'd never visually seen, guided entirely by radio vectors from ships beyond the horizon? It was like having an all-seeing eye in the sky, feeding perfect information directly to the hunters, but radar did something else, something even more psychologically devastating. To Japanese pilots, it created what American pilots called the electronic fence. In early 1943, the Navy began deploying radar picket ships, destroyers positioned 50 to 60 miles ahead of carrier task forces, specifically to provide early warning. These ships existed solely to push the radar detection bubble outward, giving carriers even more warning time. By mid-1944, that radar fence extended over 150 miles from the fleet center. For Japanese pilots, it meant this. The moment they took off from their carriers and turned toward an American task force, they entered the detection zone. Every mile they flew brought them deeper into an electronic net where their position, altitude, and heading were precisely known. American fighters were already launching, already being vectored toward them, and would hit them long before they reached striking range. It was like trying to stage a surprise attack while someone screamed your position on a loudspeaker every 30 seconds. And then, in early 1943, the Americans introduced something that made attacking U.S. ships even more terrifying. The VT proximity fuse. Traditional anti-aircraft shells used timed fuses. Gunners estimated the altitude and range of incoming aircraft, set the fuse to detonate at a specific time after firing, and hoped the shell exploded near the target. It required perfect calculations, and even skilled gun crews achieved hit rates below 5%. The VT fuse was different. It contained a miniature radar transmitter and receiver in the nose of the shell. When fired, the fuse detected radio reflections from nearby aircraft. When the shell passed within about 70 feet of a plane, it detonated automatically. The results were devastating. VT-fused anti-aircraft fire achieved success rates of 70%, 14 times more effective than conventional shells. For Japanese pilots, it meant that getting close to American ships became a death sentence. Shells didn't need to hit them directly. They just needed to pass nearby, and the proximity fuse would do the rest. The sky around American fleet became filled with automated death, explosions blooming whenever aircraft came within range. In November 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese High Command made a desperate decision. Conventional attacks were failing. American defenses were too strong. So they authorized a new tactic, kamikaze, divine wind, organized suicide attacks where pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. The reasoning was grimly logical. If American radar and fighters destroyed attacking aircraft before they could launch weapons, and if proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire shredded bombers before they could line up attack runs, then the only way to guarantee hitting American ships was to turn the aircraft itself into the weapon. But here's what the kamikaze planners didn't fully anticipate. Radar made their suicide attacks almost as ineffective as conventional strikes. Kamikaze pilots still had to approach the fleet. They still showed up on radar screens at 70 to 100 miles. Fighter directors still vectored interceptors toward them. And even when kamikazes broke through the fighter screen and dove toward ships, VT-fused anti-aircraft fire still tore them apart before they reached their targets. The statistics are sobering. Of approximately 3,160 kamikaze sorties launched between October 1944 and the war's end in August 1945, roughly 3,000 were shot down before reaching their targets. The radar-directed defense system, fighter vectors, proximity-fused shells, and coordinated fleet air defense achieved a kill rate exceeding 75%. From the Japanese perspective, it was incomprehensible. They were sending their most dedicated pilots on one-way missions where success was guaranteed by definition. The pilot would hit the target because he wasn't trying to escape. And yet 3/4 were being destroyed en route. This brings us to June 1944, and the battle that would prove, beyond all doubt, the absolute superiority of American radar-directed defenses. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19, 1944. The Japanese combined fleet had gathered its remaining carrier strength for one decisive battle. 9 carriers, over 430 aircraft. Japan's plan was simple: launch massive strikes that would overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers, sink enough carriers to break the American advance toward the Philippines, and turn the tide in the Pacific War. They were about to fly into the most sophisticated air defense system ever created. Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th fleet included 15 aircraft carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers, equipped with the latest radar systems. Every ship had air search radar. Every carrier had combat information centers with trained fighter directors. Every ship had proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition, and the fleet had nearly 500 aircraft, including the F-6F Hellcat, a fighter specifically designed to kill Japanese planes. At 10 a.m., radar operators aboard USS Lexington detected the first Japanese strike. Raid 1, 69 aircraft, range 150 miles, closing from the west. The fighter director's voice crackled over the radio. "Hey, Rube!" The traditional call to launch all fighters. Within minutes, Hellcats were airborne. The fighter directors watched their radar screens, tracking both the American fighters and the approaching Japanese strike. They began calling vectors: Bandits bearing 260, range 70 miles, Angels 18. The Hellcat pilots couldn't see the enemy yet. They were still 40 miles away. But they knew exactly where to go. Radar was painting them a picture, and the fighter directors were guiding them step by step toward the intercept. At 10:36 a.m., the first group of Hellcats slammed into the Japanese formation, 50 miles from the American fleet. The Japanese were still flying in neat attack formation, completely unaware they'd been detected until American fighters appeared from perfect attack positions. What followed was slaughter. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Hellcats dove through them, shooting down bombers and fighters in rapid succession. The few Japanese planes that broke through the fighters encountered a wall of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire from the screening destroyers and cruisers. Black clouds of precisely timed explosions filled the sky. Aircraft staggered, caught fire, and spiraled into the sea. Of the 69 aircraft in Raid 1, only 27 survived to return to their carriers. None hit the American fleet. Then Raid 2 appeared on radar. 130 aircraft. Range 115 miles. Again, Hellcats vectored to intercept. Again, the Japanese formation was shattered long before it reached the carriers. Again, proximity-fused shells tore apart the few planes that survived the fighters. Result: 97 aircraft lost. No hits on major American ships. Raid 3, 47 aircraft. Detected at 100 miles, intercepted, destroyed. Raid 4, 82 aircraft. Detected, intercepted, annihilated. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost over 350 aircraft, roughly 75% of their carrier aviation strength, in exchange for minor damage to a single battleship. An American pilot, returning to USS Lexington after the 4th intercept, summed it up in his debriefing. "Hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The name stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But here's what makes this battle so significant. It wasn't American pilot skill that won the day. Japanese pilots were still brave, still willing to die for their mission. The aircraft, Zeros, Judys, Jills, were reasonably capable planes. What killed them was invisibility. They couldn't hide, couldn't surprise, couldn't evade. Every formation was detected the moment it appeared over the horizon. Every approach vector was tracked precisely. American fighters always knew where to go, and proximity-fused shells always knew when to detonate. The Japanese were fighting blind against an enemy that saw everything. After the battle, American ships recovered several Japanese pilots from the water. During interrogations, the captured aviators expressed genuine confusion about how the Americans had known they were coming. Some suspected traitors aboard Japanese carriers. Others believed the Americans had somehow cracked every Japanese naval code and were reading radio messages in real time. When told about radar, many simply didn't believe it. Radio waves that could see aircraft 100 miles away? Impossible. Even after seeing the equipment, some captured pilots insisted there must be additional explanation. Perhaps spies with radios aboard Japanese carriers, transmitting positions. They couldn't accept that technology had rendered their courage, training, and sacrifice completely irrelevant. Did you know that in November 1942, Japanese officers had actually captured an intact American SC radar set when they overran Guadalcanal? Commander Takeo Nakajima personally examined the equipment and filed a report to Tokyo describing its capabilities. His report was dismissed by Japanese naval leadership as exaggerated. Surely the Americans couldn't detect aircraft at such extreme ranges. By the time Japan began serious radar development in 1943, they were 2 years behind and falling further back every month. The aftermath of the Philippine Sea battle was catastrophic for Japan. Not only had they lost 350 aircraft and their most experienced carrier pilots, they'd also lost 3 aircraft carriers to American submarines, Shokaku, Taiho, and Hyo, while the depleted air groups were unable to provide effective anti-submarine patrols. Japan's carrier aviation never recovered. For the rest of the war, Japanese carriers operated with skeleton air groups, inexperienced pilots flying obsolete aircraft against an enemy that could see them coming from over the horizon. Meanwhile, by late 1944, American radar technology was reaching capabilities that seemed impossible. Night fighters equipped with AI airborne interception. Radar could detect enemy aircraft in total darkness and close to gun range without ever seeing the target visually. Destroyers equipped with the newest SG-6 radar could detect submarine periscopes at 5 miles. Fire control radars could direct naval gunfire onto targets completely, hidden by darkness or smoke. The electronic advantage had become so overwhelming that Japanese pilots began describing American task forces as electromagnetic fortresses, places where invisible walls of detection and destruction made approach nearly impossible. By 1945, the gap had grown so wide it could no longer be called a technological advantage. It was total electronic domination. The Battle of Okinawa in April-June 1945 demonstrated this with brutal clarity. Japan launched over 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet during the 3-month campaign. Radar picket destroyers, positioned up to 70 miles from the main fleet, detected virtually every raid. Fighter directors vectored interceptors toward attackers with extraordinary precision. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire created killing zones around every ship. The results: of those 1,900 kamikaze sorties, approximately 1,400 were destroyed before reaching their targets. Despite facing an enemy literally willing to die to hit them, American radar-directed defenses achieved a 75% kill rate. Yes, kamikazes sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 others during the Okinawa campaign. But these were losses inflicted at catastrophic cost. Japan was burning through pilots, aircraft, and fuel reserves at unsustainable rates while achieving diminishing results against ever-improving American defenses. Several Japanese pilots who survived kamikaze missions, launched but recalled before reaching American forces or who suffered mechanical failures and returned, later described the psychological terror of approaching American fleets. They knew the Americans could see them coming. They knew fighters would intercept them. They knew the anti-aircraft fire would find them. Flying toward an American task force, one survivor recalled, felt like walking toward an invisible wall of death. You couldn't see it, but you knew it was there waiting to kill you. So what happened to the key figures in this story? Private Joseph Lockard and Private George Elliott, the 2 radar operators who detected the Pearl Harbor attack. Both survived the war. Lockard received a Distinguished Service Medal and went on to work in radar development. Elliott enlisted in the Army Air Forces and served until 1945. Both men spent decades afterward answering the same question. Why weren't they believed? Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, who told them, "Don't worry about it," was investigated after Pearl Harbor but ultimately cleared of wrongdoing. He later commanded a P-47 Thunderbolt squadron in the Pacific and retired as a lieutenant colonel. He maintained until his death in 2010 that with the information available to him that Sunday morning, his decision was reasonable. He was right, the failure wasn't his alone. It was systematic, institutional, a failure to understand how to integrate new technology into operational doctrine. But the radar system itself, the SCR-270 that detected the Japanese attack force at 136 miles, went on to become one of the most important early warning systems in the Pacific. Improved versions were deployed throughout the theater, from New Guinea to the Philippines to Okinawa. That failure at Pearl Harbor actually proved the technology's success. It worked exactly as designed. The system around it just wasn't ready. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded the 5th Fleet at the Philippine Sea, later called radar the single most important technological advantage in the Pacific War after 1942. He credited radar-directed fighter defense with preventing catastrophic American carrier losses during 1944-45. After the war, he advocated for continued investment in electronics and radar systems, predicting correctly that future naval warfare would be decided by technology and information rather than raw firepower. As for Japanese naval aviation, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot effectively ended it as a fighting force. Japan lost too many experienced pilots, too many aircraft, and too much institutional knowledge to rebuild. The few remaining carrier aircraft were transferred to land bases where they became kamikaze units. Japan's magnificent aircraft carriers, once the most powerful naval aviation platforms in the world, spent the rest of the war as decoys and targets, their hangar decks empty, their purpose gone. The technology gap that began with radar continued expanding through war's end. By August 1945, American ships carried radar systems that could detect aircraft at 200-plus miles, control gunfire with precision impossible just 4 years earlier, and vector fighters through pitch-black nights onto targets the pilots couldn't see. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, never fielded radar technology comparable to what the Americans were using in 1942. Did you know that after Japan's surrender, American technical intelligence teams examined captured Japanese radar equipment and found systems that were, on average, 3 years behind equivalent American designs? Japanese engineers had understood the principles. They weren't incompetent, but Japan's industrial capacity, research infrastructure, and institutional prioritization meant they could never catch up once they fell behind. The story of radar in the Pacific War teaches us something profound about the nature of technological warfare. Sometimes the most devastating weapons aren't the ones that destroy. They're the ones that reveal. Radar didn't kill Japanese aircraft. Fighters and anti-aircraft guns did that. But radar made those weapons orders of magnitude more effective by giving them perfect information. It turned guesswork into certainty, surprise into predictability, and stealth into futility. The Japanese weren't defeated because they lacked courage. They had that in abundance. They weren't defeated because their aircraft were terrible. Many were quite good. They were defeated because they were fighting blind against an enemy that could see everything, and they never closed that gap. There's a larger lesson here about warfare in the industrial age. World War II was perhaps the last conflict where raw courage and fighting spirit were assumed to potentially overcome technological disadvantage. After radar, after proximity fuses, after the atomic bomb, that assumption died. Modern warfare became about systems, about information, about technology that could render bravery irrelevant. The Japanese pilots who flew into the electromagnetic fortresses surrounding American fleets in 1944-45 weren't any less brave than those who struck Pearl Harbor in 1941, but bravery couldn't defeat radar. It couldn't overcome systematic technological superiority. It couldn't change the fact that when one side can see and the other can't, the outcome is predetermined. In post-war interviews, surviving Japanese naval officers repeatedly identified radar as one of the most significant factors in their defeat. Not the atomic bombs. Those came too late to affect most of the naval war. Not even the submarines that strangled Japan's economy. Radar, the invisible electronic net that made the Pacific Ocean transparent to American forces while leaving. Japanese forces blind. Perhaps the most poignant testimony comes from a Japanese fighter pilot who survived the war and later became a commercial airline pilot. In the 1980s, he visited the United States and toured the Naval Research Laboratory, where much of America's wartime radar development occurred. Standing before a restored CXAM radar set, the same model that had detected Japanese strikes at Coral Sea and Midway, he stood quietly for several minutes before speaking. "We thought we were clever," he finally said through a translator. "We thought our skill and courage would be enough. But you gave the sky eyes that never closed, and after that, nothing we did mattered." The story of American radar in the Pacific War is ultimately a story about the invisible barriers technology creates, barriers that are often more insurmountable than any physical wall, any ocean, any distance. When one side can see and the other cannot, the war is already over. The rest is just counting casualties. Japanese pilots couldn't believe American radar found them before they took off. By the time they understood how it was far too late to matter,